I first saw him the night my uncle disappeared. It was the summer of 1966, and the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and dying leaves. My uncle had always been obsessed with the sky, tracking strange lights, listening to radio signals he swore weren't from Earth. That night, he was in his backyard, squinting through a pair of binoculars, mumbling something about how they were getting closer. I was inside, staring at the black and white static of his old television, when I heard the back door creak open. I stepped outside, expecting to see him still fixated on the sky. Instead, I saw him standing stiff, his neck craned upward, eyes locked on something in the trees. Then he whispered something that made my stomach drop. "He's here." At first, I didn't see him. Just trees, dark silhouettes against the night sky. Then I caught the glint of something metallic near the fence line. My breath hitched. A man stood there, tall, impossibly still. His suit shimmered like liquid mercury under the porch light, but it wasn't his clothes that made my blood run cold. It was his face. His mouth stretched too wide, as if the skin at his cheeks had been torn and pulled into place. His lips were thin, almost colorless, but the grin never faltered. He had no eyebrows, no hair at all, just smooth, pale skin stretched too tight over his skull. His eyes. God, his eyes weren't human. They glowed, not like an animal's in the dark, but like something burning from within. I stepped back, gripping the door frame. My uncle didn't move. He didn't scream. He only stood there, his breath shallow, his hands clenched into fists. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Don't look away." But I did, just for a second. And in that second, he was gone. I turned back. My uncle was no longer by the fence. No sound, no struggle, nothing but the wind rattling through the trees. My pulse thundered in my ears as I scanned the yard, searching for him, for it. But the man was gone too. Something crunched in the grass behind me. I spun around, heart slamming against my ribs. The back door was wide open, swaying on rusted hinges. I stepped inside, calling my uncle's name, but the house was empty. The only sound was the hum of the television, the static shifting, warping, until through the fuzz and crackle, a voice whispered, "He's watching." A shadow passed outside the window. I ran. I didn't stop running until my legs burned and my chest felt like it might collapse. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away. But even as I tore through the darkened streets, I could feel it. I was being watched. The streets were empty, the houses dark. It was late, but the town felt wrong. Too quiet. No crickets, no distant hum of cars. Not even the sound of my own footsteps seemed loud enough. I stopped beneath a street lamp, chest heaving, eyes scanning the shadows. Then I heard it. Static. At first, I thought it was coming from inside my head, a low, buzzing hum that made my teeth ache. But then I noticed something. Every TV in every house lining the street was on. Faint, flickering light bled through the windows. Black and white fuzz shifting and warping like something alive. And then, movement. In every screen, just for a second, I saw him. The grinning man, too tall, too still, watching. I staggered back, nearly tripping over the curb. A flicker of motion caught my eye. My reflection in a car window, except I wasn't alone. He stood behind me. I turned. Nothing. My stomach twisted itself into knots. This wasn't just fear. This was something deeper, an instinctual, primal terror. The kind that made my skin crawl and my throat tighten. My uncle was gone, vanished into thin air, and I had no idea what had taken him. But I knew one thing. I was next. I forced myself to move, heading straight for the only place that felt safe, my uncle's house. The air was thick with the scent of rain as I climbed the porch steps, my hands trembling as I reached for the door. It was still open, just as I'd left it. Inside, everything was the same, except for the television. The static had changed. Now there was something in it. Shapes, shifting and warping, forming images that didn't make sense. I took a step closer, squinting. A forest, a clearing. Something standing in the center, its face obscured. The screen crackled, the image distorting, and then the screen went black. I turned to leave, only to see the reflection in the darkened screen. Not mine, his. The grinning man was standing in the doorway behind me, and he was getting closer. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. My entire body locked up as I stared at his reflection in the television screen. He was closer now. That metallic suit shimmered under the flickering light, but his grin, that awful stretched grin, was what paralyzed me. His lips didn't move, his chest didn't rise or fall. He didn't breathe. He just stood there, watching. The screen flickered again, and for a fraction of a second, his reflection distorted. His face stretched unnaturally, his mouth widening too much, revealing rows of sharp, needle-like teeth. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the image snapped back to normal. My body finally listened to my brain. I bolted. I didn't care where I was running. I needed to get away. I sprinted through the house, nearly tripping over furniture, but the moment I reached the front door, it slammed shut. I yanked at the knob, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but it wouldn't budge. The air behind me shifted. He was in the room. I didn't want to turn around, but I could feel him. The temperature dropped, my breath coming out in quick, visible puffs. My skin prickled as that static hum filled my ears, growing louder, warping into something that almost sounded like words. I forced myself to look. The hallway was empty, but something had changed. The walls, the furniture, everything was wrong. The house had warped, stretching like melting wax. Doors were gone. The windows had disappeared. The room was sealing itself shut, trapping me inside. Then the static became clear. Come closer. The voice didn't belong to anything human. It was distorted, hollow, a sound that burrowed into my skull. I slapped my hands over my ears, shaking my head. No, I whispered. The light overhead flickered violently. Come closer. I ran. I had no plan. I had no escape. But I ran anyway. I threw myself toward the last door left in the house, my uncle's bedroom. The second I crossed the threshold, the air felt heavier, thicker, like I was walking through something alive. Then I saw it. The closet door, slightly ajar. Something inside was moving. My stomach twisted as I stepped forward. My hands trembled as I reached for the handle. The second my fingers touched the wood, the television behind me screamed. A burst of static filled the room, warping and twisting into a sound that wasn't just noise. It was agony, a shriek of something wrong, something that didn't belong in this world. The lights burst, plunging the room into darkness. And then, silence. I turned, heart pounding so violently I thought it might stop altogether. The television screen had gone black. But in the reflection, the closet door was wide open, and something was inside, watching, waiting. The closet door yawned open, revealing a darkness so thick it felt alive. Something moved inside, not fast, not sudden, just the slow, deliberate shift of something watching from the black. My breath hitched. I wanted to run. Every part of me screamed to turn away, to flee, to break down the walls if I had to. Anything but stand here and wait for it to emerge. But my body had turned to stone. My pulse roared in my ears, drowning out every rational thought. Then I saw them, eyes. Not one pair, not two, dozens, faint, glowing pinpricks like dying embers, scattered throughout the black void of the closet. They weren't blinking. They weren't moving. They were waiting. The air grew heavy with the scent of something rancid, decay like rotting meat left in the sun. A whisper curled through the room, soft at first, barely audible over the static still humming from the television. Then it became clearer. He brought you here. My stomach clenched. My legs twitched, the primal instinct to run kicking in again. I took a shaky step backward, but the moment my foot touched the floor, the eyes moved. They blinked in unison, vanishing for a split second before appearing closer. I sucked in a sharp breath. Then the whisper changed. Don't look away. The same words my uncle had spoken before he disappeared. The closet door slammed open, the entire room shuddering as if the walls themselves were breathing. My mouth went dry, shapes shifted in the dark, humanoid but wrong. Tall, thin things, their limbs too long, their bodies contorted in ways that defied anatomy. Their skin was like damp paper, stretched tight over bones that jutted at odd angles. One of them stepped forward. I stumbled back, but something cold wrapped around my wrist. My breath hitched. I didn't have to look to know what had grabbed me. The Grinning Man. The moment I felt his grip, everything changed. The room melted away. The air turned thick and suffocating. A deep guttural hum filled my skull, not in my ears, but inside my mind. My vision swam, the walls warping, twisting, shifting, until suddenly I wasn't in the house anymore. I was in the clearing, the same one from the television. I barely had time to react before I realized I wasn't alone. They were everywhere. The hollow ones, standing in a perfect circle, their heads tilted, their empty eyes locked on me. The Grinning Man was there too, just beyond them, his mouth still twisted in that grotesque, unnatural smile. And then I heard it. A voice from behind me, slow, familiar. A voice I never should have heard again. You shouldn't have looked away. I turned and saw my uncle. His eyes were missing. I couldn't breathe. My uncle stood before me, his skin pallid, stretched thin over his face like wax about to melt. But it was his eyes, or rather the absence of them, that paralyzed me. Two empty sockets, gaping holes where his eyes should have been, raw and oozing. His lips moved, but his voice, it didn't come from his throat. It came from everywhere. You shouldn't have looked away. My stomach twisted. I wanted to scream, to turn, to run, but the moment I tried, my legs refused to move. The air around me was wrong, thick like tar, pressing in on me, suffocating. Then they moved. The hollow ones. They stepped forward in unison, their limbs jerking unnaturally like broken marionettes. Their faces were devoid of features, just smooth, pale skin where their eyes, noses, and mouths should have been. But they didn't need eyes, because they saw me anyway. The static returned, drilling into my skull, filling my head with something more than just sound, thoughts that weren't mine. Images flashed through my mind like a reel of film on fire. A woman staring at the sky, her mouth open in a silent scream. A child's body, twisted, contorted into an inhuman shape. A man clawing at his face, tearing at his eyes until there was nothing left but raw, red ruin. They were showing me what happens when you see too much. I squeezed my eyes shut, a sob ripping through my throat. No, I wouldn't let them in, but it was too late. Something cold pressed against my forehead. I opened my eyes. The Grinning Man was standing inches from me. Up close, his face was worse than I'd imagined. His skin wasn't just smooth. It was wrong, like synthetic flesh stretched over something that didn't quite fit. His grin was too wide, splitting his face nearly in half. But it was his eyes that shattered me. They weren't his. They were my uncle's. Still wet, still bleeding. Staring back at me, I screamed. But the moment the sound left my throat, everything changed. The clearing dissolved. The hollow ones melted into the darkness. The Grinning Man faded, his hideous smile vanishing like smoke. And suddenly, I was back in my uncle's house. Everything was normal. No broken walls. No static. No Grinning Man. For a moment, I thought it had been a nightmare. Until I saw the mirror, saw my reflection, saw the empty, gaping sockets where my eyes had been. And behind me, he was still there, still grinning, still watching. Part 6, the last mistake. I refused to accept it. The gaping holes where my eyes had once been, the unbearable silence pressing in on me. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. My hands shook as they hovered over my face, over the raw, wet absence where sight had once been. But I could still see, not through my own eyes, through his. The Grinning Man stood behind me, motionless, his grotesque grin frozen in place. His stolen eyes, my uncle's eyes, locked onto me with terrible amusement. And then, He spoke. "You weren't supposed to be here." My breath hitched. The grinning man had never spoken before. Not to me, not to anyone. His voice wasn't a voice at all. It was inside me, vibrating through my skull, rattling my ribs like the hum of something massive, something ancient. The hollow ones stirred in the background, shifting unnaturally, their faceless heads tilting as if they too had heard something wrong. Because something was wrong. I wasn't supposed to be here. The grinning man took a step forward, not gliding, not disappearing, walking. That was new. I stumbled back, my hands grasping blindly for anything to ground myself, but there was nothing, just void. The world around me was unraveling, stretching, bending like film burning in slow motion. And then I realized I had changed something. The grinning man twitched. A flicker of static crackled across his face, distorting him for a split second, and for the first time, his grin faltered. He looked confused. He stepped forward again, but this time it was hurried, almost desperate. The hollow ones whispered in unison, their voices thin, warping, concerned. They had made a mistake. They had taken the wrong person. I wasn't meant to be the one to replace him. I had seen too much, yes, but I wasn't part of their order. I wasn't part of their cycle. Something had gone wrong, and now the grinning man, the real one, was breaking. The static in my head turned to a deafening shriek. The hollow ones trembled, their smooth, featureless faces beginning to crack. The void around me rippled like glass about to shatter. And then I saw it, a second shape standing just beyond the darkness. My uncle. His body was barely there, flickering between what had once been human and something else. But he wasn't reaching for me. He was reaching for the grinning man. The moment his fingers touched that awful, grinning face, the entire world collapsed. A sound like tearing fabric, a rush of air that wasn't air, a sudden feeling of being ripped backward. And then I was standing in my uncle's living room. The television was off. The house was silent. And I was whole. I staggered forward, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My hands flew to my face. My eyes were there. I could see. I could feel. I was back. But my uncle, he was gone. I turned, heart pounding, expecting to see the grinning man behind me, expecting to hear that sickening whisper in my ear. But the house was empty. The mirror still stood across the room. My reflection stared back at me, pale, shaking, but normal. And yet, something had changed. The static was gone. The grinning man was gone. The cycle was broken. And for the first time in what felt like eternity, no one was watching.